again, and welcome to our next module here in the class. And what we're going to be doing here in this module and in the next is looking at the issue of eating and food and how Catholic social teaching and Catholic ethics ought to shape our attitudes towards something that we all do and that plays a significant part in practically everyone's life. And as you might be thinking to yourself at this point, right, this is a topic that's a little different than, say, most of the other topics that we have touched on so far in this class. But I think it's helpful to include this for a number of reasons, right? So for one thing, I think it's helpful to include something like eating or food and animal products to discuss how Catholic social teaching and Catholic ethics really impacts the way we live in its entirety, right? That it's really not just about controversial issues, or it's not just about sort of the primary planks that we would hear about in an election year, or the kind of things that we might hear even in a typical homily or sermon, right? That really Catholic social teaching, building on Catholic ethics, is a comprehensive worldview, right? And it really ought to shape the way we live in all different facets of our lives from day to day. And so for this course, right, I think it's important to really get a grounding in some of those big issues like just war or the environment or capital punishment. But I think it's also good to practice applying this to a more mundane topic, right? One where the stakes maybe aren't quite as high in terms of the political controversy. Although, of course, as we all know, right, there is a fair bit of controversy around how Americans eat and how Americans produce food. And so Catholic social teaching does have some things to say about that. Right, another reason that I include a couple modules on this topic is that I, in many cases, find that teaching about the ethics of food or the ethics of eating is actually very beneficial and helpful in terms of introducing people to Catholic thinking and Catholic thought, right? And so working in an environment where in many or most of my undergraduate courses, right, I really have a cross-section of people who have a strong grounding in the Catholic faith, people who kind of are not terribly active Catholics, people coming from other churches, other denominations, and then of course people who have no real Christian background whatsoever or are part of another religious tradition. In a lot of those cases, right, sort of diving into the real nitty-gritty hot-button issues of Catholic sexual ethics or medical ethics, I've found over the years to be problematic, if not counterproductive, right? That trying to right off the bat talk about, for example, why the church forbids artificial contraception, in many cases students aren't really open to considering those arguments, right? That it is so contrary to their experience, contrary to what they've heard and been taught over the years, and that they're not really open to considering that in even a critical way, let alone being maybe predisposed to pay attention to what I'm saying to them. Right, and so one of the things that I often have tried to do in recent years is to find some common ground, right? To find some areas where I might be able to draw connections between a Catholic view of life and the world and their own views, right? As a way to introduce them to Catholic thinking in a way that is going to resonate with them, right? And I would say, now some might argue, right, that I'm watering things down. But I would say instead that I'm adopting a sort of Pauline approach, right? And the Apostle Paul very famously says that he becomes all things to all people in order to win some. And I think in the area of food and how we produce our food and how we eat, this is a place where many Americans who aren't necessarily open to religious ideas in other areas, they are open to kind of critical analysis, right? And that there is, in fact, a willingness on the part of many people to question the way they live, right? The way they eat, right? That many people who eat lots of fast food or who drown themselves in cheeseburgers or whatever it might be, are willing to at least acknowledge that there is room for criticism, right? And to think critically about that and about how we produce food in this country. Organic and gluten-free and all these things are very trendy, right? And we don't necessarily want to latch on to trends. But on the other hand, if it creates an opening, if it creates a potential for dialogue, then I think St. Paul would lead us to take advantage of that, right? That if we can find a place where we can make Catholic values and Catholic teaching attractive to people, that can be a useful thing, right? And as we're going to talk about here in this module and the next, I think there are some overlaps between what Catholic social teaching would say about food and eating and some of the critical perspectives being raised in our culture. And so I think that can be a way of drawing people in who might not be initially open to some of the other aspects of Catholic social teaching. Now, if we turn that around, right, that would also explain maybe why, for say in this course, in this program, I saved this module to the end, right? Is that in my experience in covering ethics and Catholic social teaching with people who are committed Catholics, that this is actually one of the places where there is some hesitancy and there's some questioning of what might be the Catholic social teaching perspective on this. And so when it comes to this program, I tend to save this towards the end as a way of building on kind of what we've already established in terms of Catholic social teaching and getting people to build up to this, right? And as you may have noticed, right, some of the more recent modules are issues where there is more disagreement, more debate amongst many faithful Catholics, particularly those in the Midwest. And so this would fall into that category, right? That if we go to a good potluck as some vibrant parish here in Kansas and try to make an argument about animal rights or reforming the American food system, you're not necessarily going to find the same open and inviting atmosphere that you might if you were going to go and talk about respect for life or traditional marriage, right? And so again, it will be interesting to hear from you all what you think about some of the ideas raised here. But in terms of sending you all out to share the faith in whatever venue you're going to do that here after the program, one thing to take away from this process is to think about how you introduce topics, how you challenge people while also affirming and solidifying the foundations that they already have. And so just to, kind of show you how the sausage is made, to maybe not be the best metaphor for this particular module, but maybe it works. That's kind of my thinking process in doing this module here with you all now. So what I want to do then, now that we've kind of gotten the preliminaries out of the way, is to actually turn now and focus on the issue of food, and in particular the issue of the treatment of animals in the production of food in America. And so this is going to be including obviously the production of meat of all kinds, but also including the production of eggs and milk and other dairy products in America today. So I want to think about what Catholic social teaching would lead us to think about or perhaps advocate for changes in the way that we do that in America. So what is the debate about the treatment of animals or the use of animals in the production of food in America today? Well, in a lot of cases, right, what we see happening is the debate is defined as a fight between two sides, right? So on the one hand, we have those who would argue something along the lines of meat is murder, right? So we have heard that slogan from PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, and they would argue very forcefully, right, that the use of animals to create meat is unethical, right, and that it is unethical because you are killing a living thing, and that is wrong. You can get into more sophisticated versions of this, right? So one of the most prominent philosophers in America today, and really the one who is often singled out as the most influential living American philosopher, is a guy named Peter Singer, who we have probably talked about before in the program. And he's a very prominent utilitarian. and he argues that right and wrong is based on a pure math of pleasure and pain, right? And he basically argues that when you look at the production of meat, when you look at the way the animals are raised and then the way the animals are slaughtered, and you compare the pain and suffering from those experiences from the production side and compare it to the pleasure that is generated in terms of the consumption of the meat or the animal products, that the math is very straightforward, right? And that the pain and suffering produced is significantly greater, right? Especially when you say that the human enjoyment of their food could at least be largely matched by vegetarian options, right? And so while Singer is a little more sophisticated than Meat is Murder, his argument is basically along those lines that whatever pleasure or benefits we get from eating animals and eating animal products, that it is outweighed by the pain and suffering of the animals themselves, and therefore we ought not to do it, right? And so when we see PETA ads, when we hear the arguments for strictly vegetarian or vegan lifestyles, this is the kind of argument that you hear, right? That these are lives, and that we shouldn't be killing animals, or we shouldn't be keeping animals in captivity in order to eat them or eat eggs or dairy products. Right, so that's one side of the debate we hear. The other side of the debate basically diametrically opposes everything that PETA would have to say. Right, so of course you have the bumper stickers you'll see of PETA standing in this case for people eating tasty animals, right? And so there's a strong backlash against PETA in its arguments. And this would say basically that we can and should eat whatever animals we like. Now, in terms of a little more theological perspective on this, right, one form that this would take is to say, from a Christian perspective, people will point to the biblical material and they will say, look, in the Garden of Eden, human beings are given dominion over the rest of the created world, right? That human beings are placed in this position of authority over the plants and the animals and the environment, right? And they would say that it's clear from the creation account that human beings are the pinnacle of creation, and that creation really, in fundamental ways, serves to meet the needs of human beings, right? So they would also then point to other passages in Scripture where it's made clear that people are, in fact, able to eat animals, everything from God's covenant with Noah up to St. Peter and his vision of all the clean and unclean animals and being told he can eat any of them, right? So in response to PETA, many people would point to the Bible and say, no, in fact, it's very clear from the Bible that we can and should eat animals and eat animal products. Along with that, right, there is a sort of understandable backlash against PETA and its deliberately provocative ads, right? So you'll see in PETA ads basically putting in graphic form the idea that human beings and animals are morally equivalent, right? And just as we shouldn't kill a person to eat them, we shouldn't kill a cow or a pig to eat them, right? And so people react very strongly against that, but then reach the conclusion that, well, since PETA says that animals have the same rights as people, the response is then, well, we're going to argue that animals have no rights, right? That we're going to match PETA's outrageous claims by saying, no, animals don't have rights. And maybe subconsciously thinking, well, if that's what believing that animals have rights looks like, then we're going to have nothing to do with that. And so there's a move away from that extreme to a position that says we're not going to consider animals as having any rights. And in fact, biblically speaking, we have clear dominion over the animal world, so we can treat or use animals in whatever form or format that we desire. Now, as you can obviously guess from kind of the way I've been phrasing these different positions, right, I'm going to argue that in both cases, it's not a particularly good position to hold, right? So when we look at Singer and PETA, I think it's obvious that this is a problematic viewpoint, particularly from the perspective of Catholic belief or ethics and social teaching. Really, as we've discussed in other ethics courses, right, utilitarianism, while it can produce, I think, good, helpful conclusions in some areas, right, that we ought to find what common ground we can with people who believe differently. So if we can partner with utilitarians to deal with some specific problems, that's great. But really, that when you adopt utilitarianism as a consistent ethical framework, I think it's deeply problematic, right? And it is going to produce positions that are diametrically opposed to Catholic teaching on any number of issues, particularly in the areas of sexual and medical ethics, but in other places as well, right? So Singer's approach, I think, is going to be problematic. And PETA's approach of equating human dignity and value with animal value, I think, is ultimately not going to be acceptable for people, right? In terms of the biblical evidence, clearly it's not a valid argument, right? That it is abundantly clear in Scripture that animals are not the equivalent of human beings, right? This is clear from the creation story onward. And even if we're going to think about this in terms of natural law, right? That when we look at the way human beings have lived and flourished over the centuries and even over the millennia, when we look at what is the common, consistent ethical teaching of different cultures throughout time, right? This is not an idea that we find there, right? That yes, there are certain cultures that have a particular aversion to eating animals or eating animal products. For example, in India, right, this is something we see, but this is certainly not a consistent ethic that we find throughout world history, right? So that if it were really part of natural law that animals ought not to ever be killed or used for the production of food, we would expect to see that, right? But we in fact don't see that. And so I think if we're going to operate from a Christian perspective, either in terms of biblical tradition or natural law, this attitude of equating animals and human beings is just not going to be persuasive. And I would argue that the other extreme has problems as well, right? And so this is often referred to as a sort of dominion perspective on the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And I think it is a misreading both, again, of the biblical tradition and of natural law, right? That if we look at the biblical tradition, human beings do have a special, unique role in creation, right? That God sets Adam and Eve up and given a status that differs from the rest of the physical world. But if we look at the creation account, right, this is not a position of exploitation, right? This is not a position where one is free to do whatever strikes their fancy or whatever will produce the most pleasure at the moment, right? They are put in a position of stewardship, right? They are gardeners in a garden, right? And anyone who has any understanding of how gardening works knows that there are limits, right? That one, you can't garden simply with the goal of extracting as much production as possible from any particular plot of ground any particular year. And you can do that on occasion, but there are ramifications for that, right? And that the most successful gardeners are gardeners who build a garden over time, who build fertility, who build quality soil, who do all of these complicated things that are going to lead you to limit your consumption in certain areas, are going to force you to think about what is best for the soil, what is best for the beneficial pollinating insects. All those kinds of things need to be taken into consideration. So the gardener still benefits from the natural world, but it is not a position of dominion. It is a position of stewardship, right, where you take the resources that you have available and you use them in a way that both preserves and enhances those resources and also provides for human needs and enjoyment. And I think we can find that sort of model for human interaction with the natural world, again, running not just in Genesis, but throughout the biblical narrative, right? When you look at the Old Testament law, and there are requirements in the Mosaic Law to let land lie fallow on a regular rotation, right, to preserve the fertility. You're commanded to allow, you can't muzzle the oxen as it treads the grain. Right? The idea here is that you need to recognize and respect the needs of the animals that are working for you, right? That as the oxen kind of walk around in that circle, grinding that big old millstone to produce your grain, you have to leave them free to eat some of the bits that kind of fall in the path, right? Then a recognition of the right of the animal to proper treatment. And again, we can find this all through Scripture, right? When Jesus uses the parable of comparing people to sparrows, right? And if God sees a sparrow fall, surely he knows about us. I think, as I've said before, right, this is going to imply that there is some value to that sparrow's life, right? That it doesn't do any good to be a certain magnitude greater than 0. The parable is only persuasive if, in fact, the sparrow has a value and a dignity. Right, so I think we can find in Scripture evidence for the idea that animals do, in fact, have a value that ought to be respected, and that human beings' position is one of supporting and fostering the fruitfulness and health of the natural world, including animals. In terms of natural law, again, I think we can see this as well, right? That when you look at what leads to human flourishing, it is going to be more this model of stewardship. Of caring for and supporting the natural world, including animals, right? And we've all probably heard countless stories and seen in movies, right, that people ought to care for the animals under their care, and that doing so produces better results. And again, just in terms of natural law, right, when we think about, say, for example, character development, when we look at kind of the real outliers of what is the worst possible character, when we look at studies of mass murderers and psychopaths, it's interesting that one of the things that is often seen as an indicator of that tendency in a person is cruelty to animals, right? That one of the things that people will tell you to watch for, say, in children, is if that they are intentionally cruel to animals, that is a sign of potential serious problems down the road. This is more broadly kind of famously attributed to Gandhi as well, right? That he said that you could tell the character of a culture by the way it treats its animals. And I think in a natural law perspective, this makes sense, right? That one's attitude towards how to treat animals is going to help shape your attitude towards other people. Particularly, it's going to shape your attitudes towards how you treat those who are weaker or those who are, say, on the margins of society. Are you going to treat them in a way that respects their dignity even though you have the power to do otherwise? And so I think both from a biblical perspective and from a natural law perspective, we can argue that while they don't have the values that PETA or Singer would say they do, that animals do have a value that ought to be respected, and that acting in accord with that value is beneficial both for the animals and is also beneficial for people in terms of developing their character and allowing them to flourish. So then, let's assume for the time being, right, that we can reach some consensus or agreement on this point, right, that while rejecting the idea that animals are equal to humans, that yes, they do have a value as part of God's good creation, and that we ought to treat them in accord with that value. So what does that mean for us in America today? Right? Because again, part of the idea of this is thinking about how Catholic social teaching can really shape some of the day-to-day ways that we live. Now, in other parts of my life, I teach an entire course on the ethics of food and eating, right? And in that context, I can talk at some length about the American food system and how it got to be where it is today and all the different alternatives being proposed, but we're not going to obviously do that here. So I really just want to focus in on a couple aspects of the American food system here for us to think about in terms of a Christian or Catholic way of treating animals, right? So the first would be how we get our eggs, right? And so this is one that is particularly, I think, struck home for me. I may have mentioned in another module or context or course that I actually regularly keep chickens, right? So at present I have, 23 chickens, I believe, at home. hopefully at this point laying some eggs for me, right? So how on earth did I end up raising a small flock of chickens, right? Well, in part it was in developing material like this for various courses, right? And what I did was start to look into some of the different concerns about the American food system. And so if you look into modern American egg production, you will quickly find a lot of information and material out there. And this is somewhat more of a hot button issue than it has been in recent years, because California recently passed a law forbidding certain kinds of cages for egg production called battery cages. So they mandated that laying hens be given bigger cages and other adjustments to the way eggs have traditionally been produced, which has resulted in an increase in prices, right? Because most egg producers are going to accommodate themselves to whatever the standards are in California, because it's such a huge American market that it becomes a real economic liability to not be able to sell eggs in California or to sell the distributors who service California. And so even though it's a California law, it has a ripple effect across the nation. Now, why did California pass that law? Why does your professor himself keep a small flock of chickens in his backyard? Well, for one thing, they're in many cases kind of amusing to watch, and the kids have a lot of fun throwing grain to the chickens and going out and collecting eggs. But more pragmatically, or I guess the real reason why I started doing this was looking at how eggs are produced, right? And so I will put some links on Blackboard for you to take a look at. But when you look at the way eggs are produced, when you go to Walmart or Dillon's and go to the egg section, and you find, there's the cheap eggs and there's the fancier eggs, right? And if you look especially at the cheap eggs and look into how those eggs are produced, at least I found it very appalling, is that we have these visions of chickens wandering around a chicken yard and scratching at the dirt and eating worms and that sort of thing. In reality, these chickens are raised by the thousands and tens of thousands in giant, essentially warehouses, right? There's no farm involved. There's a very large kind of warehouse type building that has rows and rows and rows of these battery cages stacked multiple cages high. And again, you can do even minimal digging around on Google. We'll find all of this information for you. But the kind of standard practice is they are in wire cages, and each chicken has less than a sheet of paper size area to exist in, right? They're in cages that are larger than that, but there's 2 or 3 hens per cage. So each chicken only has about the size of a sheet of paper or less. The cages are slanted so that when the eggs are laid, that they will roll down into a channel to keep them away from the chickens so they don't get soiled. But basically this means that these chickens spend their entire lives in an area about the size of a sheet of paper. And then there's a whole host of other things that go along with this, obviously. That's going to be very cramped. There's all kinds of artificial lighting to manipulate their laying cycles. They are deprived of food at certain points to force them to molt in a way that maximizes production. And at the end of the line, again, I could go on and on about all of this. It's going to mean that the chickens can't do any of the things that chickens naturally do, right? There's no scratching in the dirt. There's no preening their feathers. There's no establishing a pecking order in a little flock. Any of those sorts of behaviors. None of that is possible in this sort of environment, right? And so in studying that and learning more about it, I started thinking about trying to reconcile that with my growing immersion in natural law, right? And in thinking about the kind of arguments I make in natural law and explaining it to people. I talk about how the way we ought to live is a way that matches with human nature, right? And it's a way that results in human flourishing, right? And that you should live in a way that fits with the way God made you, and that is going to lead to you becoming kind of the ideal person that you can be, right? There's going to be variations in what our ideal of each one of us is going to be, but there are some commonalities as well. And so I was making these kinds of arguments. And so again, if we take the logic over, right, and again, recognizing that chickens are not people, right? And it is okay to treat a chicken as a means to an end. It is okay to treat a chicken as a what, not a who, because it is a what. But that being said, right, if we take this idea of we ought to act in a way that keeps with the nature of how God made things, and we ought to act in a way that allows things to flourish, to realize God's plan for them, I don't think that line of reasoning is compatible with the way that most eggs are produced in America today, right? That whatever we might say about chickens, they're certainly not people. But I think it's obvious in looking at a chicken, and certainly now having raised them, chickens were made to exist in a certain way. God made them that way, insofar as they are animals and creatures. And it's very fascinating to me, right, that you can order chickens through the mail, right? It's actually possible to order chickens and they get shipped to you next day air, and it turns out they're fine because they're programmed to be able to go for a day or two without any food or water, because when chickens hatch in normal circumstances, right, they don't all hatch at the same time, and so the chicks need to be able to survive for a day or two without food and water while their brothers and sisters hatch. So you get these chickens in the mail. They don't ever see a grown-up chicken in some cases. If you take them and put them and raise them and do all the proper things, and you put them outside, lo and behold, they will act like chickens, right? They will scratch, they will make dust baths, they will build a little pecking order, they will do all those sorts of things because it is their nature to do those things, right? And then when they get old enough, they will go find a nice secluded spot and they will lay their eggs in what they think is a nest, and so on and so forth, right? So it seems clear to me that God made these chickens to act in certain ways, which of course has been shaped by human breeding, but there is still a nature there. So I think it makes sense to me, at least, right, that when we look at how we ought to treat chickens, we ought to, as much as possible, accommodate the way they are made, right, and to allow God's plan for these creatures to be realized as much as possible. And I don't think that is compatible with the way that most eggs are produced in America today. Now, that being said, right, there are all kinds of prudential problems that would need to be faced, right? That it is very difficult to produce eggs on the scale that we consume them in America using kind of traditional farming methods. I don't know that it's impossible, but it would certainly be very difficult and certainly be a challenge. But I think we could reasonably make moves in that direction, right? Now, would that mean eggs are more expensive? Almost certainly, right? Does that mean that we ought not to do it? I don't think so. Right now, it might mean that we need to think incrementally about how to move towards a better system, right? Because it is important to be able to provide enough quality food for people. And if we need to do what is necessary to feed the hungry, certainly. But there could be a move towards a better quality product, a product that better respects the animals that we are making use of, that might result in higher prices, less profits, that sort of thing. And I think, in fact, that would still be compatible, and it would, in fact, fit with many aspects of Catholic social teaching. A very similar thing, I think, could be said about most meat production in America. I have raised meat. I've raised chicken myself, but I haven't ever tried to raise beef or swine at this point. I haven't quite gotten to that level of homesteading yet. Maybe someday. But I have, again, looked into it a fair bit, even if I haven't tried my hand at this particular aspect of American food production. But the way we get most of our beef and pork and other animal products like that is in many ways very analogous to the way that we get our eggs, right? Is that most of these animals are not raised in sort of the red and white farms and barns. They aren't roaming fields, although in some aspects of production there is grazing of cattle, at least in a lot of situations, before they get sent to feedlots. But really kind of the heart of modern American meat production is CAFOs, right, or concentrated animal feeding operations, right? And so this is what you drive by out in western Kansas and other parts of the country, especially, there's some here, but in the Carolinas, there's a lot of pork production, for example, right? And you have, again, basically warehouses full of animals, concentrated animal feeding operations, right? So they bring a whole bunch of animals together in one spot and basically continuously feed them until they reach slaughter weight, and then they are sent off to the meat processing plants. Now, when you think about it, right, this is a system that really makes sense with the goals of the modern American food system, right? And so the goals of the modern American food system are to produce a lot of very affordable food and produce substantial profits in the process, right? And the modern American food system does that remarkably well, right? That Americans eat more meat more affordably than any other people really have throughout history. And this way of raising animals, this way of raising chickens and pork and beef cattle is remarkably efficient, right, in terms of the amount of meat you can produce at low costs while still producing a significant profit. It works really well. Now, the criticism comes with the other aspects of it, right? So there are all kinds of questions about the health impacts of this system, both in terms of the quality of meat that we produce, the quantity of meat that Americans consume. There are serious questions raised about the environmental impact of these kinds of operations, right? Where in a traditional farm, as the chickens and the cows and the pigs wander around, they kind of fertilize the fields. But in these sorts of concentrated animal operations, the byproducts of the animals are actually a significant environmental problem. And there are, in fact, many places in the country where the most significant source of water pollution is, in fact, runoff from these sorts of facilities. There are all kinds of environmental issues raised by this, so we can deal with that in another module. But when we just, again, look at, in particular, the treatment of the animals, again, this is, in many cases, highly problematic, right? That I don't know the nature of cattle or swine as well personally, but when you see the depictions of the feedlots or the intensive hog operations, the animals are certainly not in anything that would resemble a sort of natural environment. And in particular, a lot of people focus on the treatment of pigs in these sorts of food production enterprises, right? That, as we probably all heard on some level or another, pigs are actually quite intelligent animals, right? And if allowed to do so, they will forage over a large area, they build nests, they do all kinds of interesting things like this. But in the production of most of the pork products that we eat, they are kept, again, in a sort of warehouse environment, in many cases in cages not big enough for them to turn around in. Many of them have significant health problems as a result of being in this environment. And the waste from a huge number of hogs combined in basically a warehouse, you can imagine what that is like, both for the workers, again, something we'll talk about in another module, but also for the animals themselves. Being in that environment is certainly got to be deeply unpleasant. And so when you look at the way this meat is produced, I think you can ask the same sort of questions as we did about eggs, right? That acknowledging that these are animals, that they are not humans, we still, I think, can ask, does this fit with the nature that God gave these creatures, right? Are they, in fact, being allowed to live as much as possible according to their nature? Are they being allowed to live in a way that fulfills God's plan for this animal? And I think we can conclude not, right? That in many of these cases, these animals do experience significant suffering throughout their lives, as Singer and others would argue. And I think that's problematic from a biblical and Christian perspective as well. So then, what are we supposed to take from all of this, right? So we've talked about these different views when it comes to the rights of animals and argued for a sort of middle ground, if you will. We've talked about some of the problems related to egg production and meat production in America. So how do we approach this properly from the perspective of Catholic social teaching and Catholic ethics? And I would argue that what we need to do is apply that sort of middle ground I think, truly Catholic vision as best we can to our current situation, right? And so that would mean that, as in all these other areas we've talked about in the course, right, we need to think what our goal is, right? And our goal ought to be the flourishing, first of all, of people, but then also the good of the created world around us, right? If for no other reason, because the true flourishing of the created world is going to be, by extension, beneficial for the people living in it and the people taking their food from it. So what does that mean then, right? Well, I think it means, to me at least, it seems convincing that we ought to aim for true flourishing in our food production, right? And I think whatever else we might debate in terms of the details, I think you would be hard-pressed to argue that a proper Catholic aim for food production is simply to maximize profits or to maximize consumption, right? That our goal can't be produce as much food as possible or to produce as much profit as possible, right? There's nothing wrong with increasing production and there's nothing wrong with a profit, but those aren't our goals, right? Our goals ought to be the flourishing of human beings and the good of the created world. So then, we need to think about how we could change the way we produce our food to better reach those goals, right? And there is where, as in many cases, right, there's going to be a lot of room for and need for serious prudential judgment, right? And how can we move from a system that I think almost everybody would agree has some significant issues when it comes to the health of the food produced, the way American people eat, the impacts of some of these kinds of productions on the environment in terms of water pollution and all sorts of other things. Clearly there are problems there. So the question is then, how do we move towards a better model, right? And again, I don't have any magic answer here. Right, I would say, much as I do in most of the other topics we look at, that we ought to do what we can reasonably be expected to do, right? And personally, I feel this conflict, right? Because I teach these courses and I talk about this extensively in some of my other classes. But at the end of the day, I still purchase a lot of products from the standard American food system when I go to Dillon's. If for no other reason, because I simply don't have the time and energy, and in particular, I don't have the money to purchase food solely from production methods that I think are really in keeping with Catholic social teaching. I just can't afford that in a way that's going to feed my family. Now, that doesn't mean that I wash my hands of it and get on with my life, right? So personally, what I try to do is to incrementally and in small ways nudge as best I can towards a better solution, right? So for me, eggs was one thing I really focused on, right? Because it was doable within my constraints, right? To have my own eggs, to raise some chickens, and to occasionally eat some of those chickens. That was something I could do that I thought was a small but real step towards producing a better food system in my small, tiny way. Maybe for some of us it's going to be something else, purchasing a different kind of eggs or going to the farmer's market or what have you. This isn't really aimed at getting to those kind of specific questions or directives, although we can certainly talk about that in the discussion. But what I really just want people to take away from this module is to think through whether or not you agree with everything. Is it really in keeping with a Catholic vision of creation and the human person to do things the way that we do for the most part in America today? And if not, then to go through the process of thinking about how could we move to something better, right? And I think even if we can take that small step of getting enough people to start moving towards something better, that can in fact, in the long run, have a significant impact and change the world for the better. And to come back to the beginning, I think a side benefit of this might be that there are many people out there in America today who don't really take Catholicism or traditional Christianity seriously. And I don't think it might be the start of a great revival, but I think if some of those people were to see Catholics and other traditional Christians advocating for these kinds of changes in significant numbers, that might be an interesting wake-up call, and that might lead some people to look again at the church in ways that they hadn't really in the past, and to take seriously what the church has to say on some other issues when they find themselves in agreement with the church and with many Catholics and other Christians on these issues of how we treat animals. So I will leave it at that for now, even though I could go on at much more length. And I am interested in hearing your thoughts and recommendations or questions or counter arguments when we discuss this on Blackboard.